We all know of the legendary Wrigley Field, located in Chicago, Illinois, one of the oldest MLB stadiums ever. But did you know there was a second Wrigley Field that was built shortly after the one in Chicago went up, called Wrigley Field, LA, or Wrigley's $1 Million Palace, going up in South Los Angeles in 1925. It was basically an extension, slightly worse version of the stadium from Chicago. Owned by William Wrigley Jr. and the city of Los Angeles, this stadium was opened in 1925 and did host one single season of MLB baseball. It was mainly known, due to its limited capacity, as a minor league ballpark, hosting the Los Angeles Angels, a PCL, Pacific Coast League team at the time, from 1925 to 1957. Also the Hollywood Stars for a few seasons, and Pepperdine, a college football team, for 1 year in 1948. The dimensions of it, ridiculously hitter-friendly, in the gaps 345 to both of them, known as a heavily offensive ballpark. Let's just take a look at the original design, and then I'll talk about the proposed renovation of Wrigley Field, LA, and kind of an alternate history scenario where Wrigley Field, LA becomes a legendary MLB stadium, because there was a path for it. But just taking a look at it, it's a very old design. It looks not identical to the old Wrigley Field, but if you Google photos of the original Wrigley Field in like the 30s and 40s, these things look very similar. The only issue with this one is there's basically no outfield seating, and it is built right into the side of a neighborhood, very similar to the one in Chicago. It does have the two-deck approach, and I actually like the setup of the upper deck more in Wrigley Field, LA. Just taking a look at kind of the design of the seating, kind of a modern design in the upper deck. Its main flaw, in my opinion, is whatever that concrete mess is down the line on each side. It looks like it's one of those unfinished Havana mansions. When you go on vacation, you ever gone to like the Dominican Republic and you have to drive 2 hours to your resort? You'll see things that look like that. They're like unfinished shacks. And I don't know what that design is. I guess that's just an old-time thing, but it was very, very clear by the mid-1950s this thing needed a renovation. And it is interesting that this was built with a capacity of 20,000. Normally, back in the day, you would figure that would suffice for an MLB ballpark, but it hosted a bunch of minor league baseball and just one season of the Angels very late in its life, when they expanded its capacity. So this is funny. In 1961, the capacity went from 22,000 to 22,457. So they added 457 seats to accommodate the Los Angeles Angels, and that was the only season of MLB baseball. The MLB expanding from 8 to 10 teams in 1960, with one of those teams being Los Angeles, and the Angels playing just one singular season at Wrigley Field, LA. The stadium at that point was criticized for its horrible parking, along with its outdated interior design. It did need a renovation, and there was the idea that they would renovate it in the late 50s. You can take a look at what it would look like fully enclosed. I think for the time period, it looks pretty impressive outside of the ridiculously ugly parking right next to it, but that's kind of standard for the time frame. While exploring ballpark possibilities for the potential relocated Brooklyn Dodgers, this was a concept expanding the Wrigley Field, LA. The upper and lower bowls would be extended all the way around, and they would install extra seating in center field. The Dodgers instead went with the beautiful LA Coliseum, because that's just a great choice. That is sad. They really should have played at Wrigley Field, LA. But they're saying it was a parking issue, but still, I mean, the Coliseum's a dump. It would have been cool to see them enclose Wrigley Field, LA. And what really would have happened to Wrigley Field, LA if the Dodgers play there a few seasons after a renovation, and then the Dodgers move into Dodger Stadium after the construction gets completed in that? What happens to it? It's kind of an interesting alternate history just looking at it. Pretty sweet facade there, but alas, nothing ended up coming of it. You had the Angels playing one season and then moving on out, and the ballpark ended up fading into irrelevancy. It hosted a few professional boxing matches. It hosted the 1938 NFL Pro Bowl. Other than that, 1959, there was a soccer-friendly match between England and the United States that was played at Wrigley Field, LA, and it did end up getting demolished in the mid-1960s, and that is the kind of the full history of Wrigley Field, LA. Not really known, pretty obscure, kind of a rare MLB ballpark that on the surface, if you look into ballparks, you probably wouldn't even come across of, considering it only hosted one official MLB season. Mainly known as a minor league park, mainly known as being completely in the shadows of the original Wrigley Field, which is kind of a shame considering when you compare both the ballparks in the same time frame, they were very similar. Of course, now Wrigley Field in Chicago is going to look a lot better. They've had a lot of renovations to it. Very impressive, but this was kind of like the Los Angeles version of it, being located right into a neighborhood, and maybe in a different timeline we would see rooftop houses going up with Wrigley Field, LA, and you would have the Angels playing there or something like that. Or, I mean, it can't be the Dodgers because they were already constructing Dodger Stadium at that point. In the Angels' lone season playing at Wrigley Field, LA, they went 71-91, not surprising considering they are an expansion team. The ballpark set a record yielding 248 home runs. That was a mark that stood for over 40 years. And it also did have the nice little ivy walls. There's a nice image of it with a palm tree that I think is a really cool contrast considering whenever we think of Wrigley Field, it's always, Chicago. You're not thinking of the coastline. You're not thinking of the Pacific. So when you see that, I think it is pretty neat. And then they do have a little image. This is Wrigley Field, LA. In MLB The Show Stadium Creator, you can see how they did it right there with the seating out in right center field. Just not much to it. It certainly needed an expansion in the mid-50s if it was going to host MLB action. But that expansion and subsequent renovation never came. I think if they would have gotten the renovation, it did have a chance to become a really nice ballpark. But since it didn't come, it ends up getting demolished just a few years later, and it becomes one of the bigger forgotten MLB stadiums in baseball history, because of it hosting only one MLB team for 1 year. But guys, that is the official story of Wrigley Field, LA. Wrigley Field out in Los Angeles. That's going to do it for this video, guys. Make sure you follow me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description.